Okay, y'all, so we're going to go ahead and look at the Emancipation Proclamation here. There's a letter uh, by Lincoln on your notes to Horace Greeley. This was published in the newspaper. Please read that on your own. It's a little bit kind of hard to understand. I just worked with my fourth period on it. But basically, of course, what Lincoln's saying is, if I could unite the Union again by freeing slaves, I would do it. If I could unite it by only freeing some slaves, I would do it. If I could unite it by not freeing any slaves, I would do it. And obviously, Lincoln's, at least his public goal, is to keep the Union united. Now, in his heart, in his mind, I think Lincoln wanted to do it. And as you guys will see as we make our way through here, Lincoln found a way to free the slaves, and he thought it was constitutional, right? So when we go to the next slide here, okay, and there's a picture of Lincoln, by the way, signing the Emancipation Proclamation, but I'm going to give you guys the key concepts here first. So on your notes, you'll read this and you will highlight the key words. I'll mention some of them. The first one is more general, right? Why does the North win the Civil War? Are they better people? Well, they have better manpower. They have more people, 3 times as many people, a lot more resources. You think of factories, right? There were virtually no factories in the South. Factories, of course, make your guns, they make your cannons, they make ammunition, they make uniforms and things like that. The North had the better leadership of Abraham Lincoln when compared to the South's Jefferson Davis, okay? And ultimately, they probably had better generals, but it didn't start out that way. Now, Lincoln is also going to make an important plan, and that is the emancipation of the slaves. He didn't do it fast enough for some people, right? But this, along with Lincoln's ability, the greater resources, is all going to combine to the Union militarily beating the South. But it's going to take 4 long years. The second concept here is more specific, and it has to do with the war begins to preserve the Union. At least that's the stated purpose. People would fight for that. Now, you would think today that people would be like, oh, free the slaves? Yeah, man, I'm happy to do that. But believe it or not, y'all, that was very controversial. In fact, there's even going to be riots in New York, y'all, after the Battle of Gettysburg, when a lot of the Irish get upset that they're being drafted, because you got to put yourself in the minds of the people then, not the minds of you today. Because when you, as an Irish person who maybe only has been here for a few years and treated pretty badly, you get drafted to go fight in this war. And when the slaves are freed, where do you think a lot of the slaves, though now former slaves or freedmen, are going to move? They're going to move up north. And who are you going to be competing with for jobs? The former slaves. So the Irish all were angry that they were being asked to help fight in a war that would end slavery, that would result in people competing with them for jobs. But they were willing, and a lot of people were willing to fight for the country if it meant getting the country back together. Now, as you guys will see, a lot of people criticize the Emancipation Proclamation and say it didn't free a single slave. It didn't do a single thing. That is not correct, and that could even be an interesting topic for you guys to write about. How would you respond to a charge that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really do anything? Because one of the things that it's going to do is it's going to keep the Europeans, particularly the French and the British all, from recognizing the Confederacy. Now, what do I mean by recognizing? If you recognize them, you say, you are an official country. We're going to send ambassadors to you. We will receive ambassadors from you. We will do trade. We will sell you weapons. And remember, the French had helped us win the American Revolution. The Confederates were hoping the same thing would happen this time with both the British and the French. But by Lincoln ending slavery, y'all, he made it very hard for the British or the French to go ahead and to give diplomatic support, okay? Now, another thing that happens, even though technically no slaves are freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, many African Americans hear about it. They escape from the southern plantations. And as you will see tomorrow, they actually enlist in the Union Army. And of course, this hurts the Confederacy because they lose a lot of their workforce. So that's the key concepts. And as you guys have probably seen this year when I put the key concepts up, there's a lot of useful information in those. And if you just kind of know the concepts, you know a lot of the history. So a lot is said in those. So that's why I'm asking you guys to underline them and do all that. All right, so let me go ahead and talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm doing this a little bit differently than I normally do with you guys, which is where I go through and I give you, every single, I give you fill in the blank things. I'm doing this by asking you guys a few questions. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, it was actually announced the week after the Battle of Antietam. Now, Antietam, y'all, was in mid-September of 1862. Remember, Lincoln had been considering freeing the slaves. When he wrote Horace Greeley, he acted like he hadn't even thought of it. But the truth be known, y'all, for several months, he had been wanting to free the slaves. But if he freed them after loss after loss after loss, it would look like an act of desperation. But when the Battle of Antietam happened, and Antietam, y'all, was pretty close. It was kind of a draw. It was the bloodiest day still in American history. Bloodier, y'all, than 9/11. Bloodier than D-Day in the number of Americans who were killed. But General Lee left the battlefield. He left that night. And so generally when you flee, you're considered the loser, regardless of the number of casualties or whatever. Lincoln uses this a week later to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. You see the document here. To be honest, it's not that exciting of a document. It's not like the Gettysburg Address filled with beautiful rhetoric and beautiful words. It's kind of more of a technical legal document listing where slaves would be free and where they wouldn't be freed and stuff like that. So that's why I'm not having y'all really read any of it. But this is the key thing, y'all. Where were slaves freed? Only in the Confederate states that were still in rebellion. So if you were a Confederate state and you were still fighting against the Union, slaves were announced to be, quote, forever free. But there was a delay. It wouldn't be until January 1st. This gave the Confederates, y'all, basically Lincoln was hoping 2 months. 2 months to maybe come back into the Union. Because if they came back into the Union, technically, they would still get to keep their slaves if they were back in the Union as of January 1st, 1863. That's also something that's forgotten. If you were a slave in part of the country that was not in rebellion, one of the so-called border states, and I'll show you what the border states are, you would stay a slave, okay? And that's often forgotten in this deal. So who was not freed? The slaves in the border states, okay? They were not freed. So, and this is why I have here, I asked the question, why did Mr. D put quotes around freed? Why do you think I put quotes around freed, y'all? They weren't really freed. Lincoln had no power in the Confederacy. The Confederate states, y'all, were not listening to Lincoln. It's not like, oh, y'all, did y'all hear? President Lincoln freed the slaves. All right, everybody, you're free to go. It didn't work that way. They just like, dude, you're not controlling us. We're a whole nother country. But in the border states, which are shown in red here, and I think I do have it where you can zoom in. Those slaves, although there weren't very many, the so-called Upper South, y'all, there weren't that many. Now, I ask you to know the names of the border states. Missouri was a slave state, but it did not join the Confederacy. Really, it was torn, y'all. There were people in Missouri for the Confederacy, people against it. Lincoln's home state of Kentucky was also a border state, right? That's where he'd been born. It had slavery, but it didn't join the Union. It's kind of hard to see up here, but this is Delaware, where President Biden is from. Very small state, not very many slaves, but it did have slavery, okay? And then finally, hard to see here, another small state, Maryland. So once again, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland are your slave states that stayed with the Union, and we call them border states. Now, you cannot understand the Emancipation Proclamation without understanding the importance of the border states, okay? Why do you think Lincoln, where he could have freed the slaves in these border states that were still listening to him, they hadn't seceded and left the Union, why didn't he free slaves there? What do you think they would have done if he told people who had spent thousands and thousands of dollars buying human beings, as repulsive as that is, that, hey, guess what? Your property's free now. They're gone. What do you think the people in those states would have done? They would have seceded and joined the Confederacy. So this is why Lincoln frees them where he can. He frees them where he can't, and where he could have, he doesn't. Now, there's also another reason here, too, y'all. Lincoln justifies, his constitutional justification for emancipation, y'all, is that this is a military necessity. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, Lincoln was looking for a loophole, right? Some way to justify ending slavery. Now, the Constitution, sadly, protected slavery. It's in there. So he's got to find a way. Well, in the Constitution, it says the president has the right to put down rebellions. If there's a rebellion in the country, the president has the right to send in troops to put it down. Remember, Lincoln sees the Confederates not as another country, but as an internal rebellion. It's a civil war. It's not a war between the United States and the Confederate States in Lincoln's mind. It's a war internally between two parts of the same country. Now, slaves, y'all, and obviously, they weren't on the side of the Confederates, right? They weren't on the side of the people who were keeping them in chains, but they were being forced to help the Confederacy. They were making uniforms. They were growing food to feed the Confederate Army. They were also making things, they were selling, they were picking cotton, tobacco, those kind of things which could be sold abroad to raise money to keep the Confederacy going. So since the slaves were being used, y'all, to help the rebellion, Lincoln said, I have the right to end slavery because it's being used to keep the rebellion going. And this is another reason why the border states are so important. The border states still had slavery, but they weren't in rebellion. This constitutional justification wouldn't have worked because were slaves in the border states helping the rebellion? No, because they weren't in rebellion. So this is a much more complicated thing. You have a lot of people like, Emancipation Proclamation didn't do anything. Yeah, it did. It was a big deal. It's just a lot more complicated than people want to give them credit for. So this was a quote from the British, y'all. The British kind of poo-pooed initially. That's the technical term, poo-pooed. Lincoln by saying where he could free a slave, he would not. And where he would, he could not. In other words, where he could free a slave, the border states, guess what? He did it. And where he would free them, where he did technically free them, he actually couldn't because he had no real power there. So, that's a lot of information. But if you guys understand this, you're smarter than a good chunk of the population who doesn't get this, if they even know what the Emancipation Proclamation is. All right, and then here's just a map once again showing you guys that, showing you Missouri, Kentucky. Those are the border states. And it is tragic, y'all. There are families who were split. I remember in Kentucky, there was one family that had a general on one side and another family member who was a general on the other side. Families were literally torn apart by this, y'all. All right, now the importance of emancipation. So I asked you to give me, I think, 3 reasons. You don't have to know all of them, but you do need to know that this is more than just kind of window dressing where Lincoln looks like he's freeing slaves when he's not. Why is it ultimately so important? Well, a lot of slaves, y'all, ran away to the Union Army. Now, I know this is going to sound like crackhead talk, but originally when this war started, y'all, if I were a slave and I think, oh man, they're Union troops, and I escape and I run to them, I would be very surprised because those guys would say, technically, dude, we have to return you back to the Confederates. But hey, I escaped. Yes, but the fugitive slave clause is still on. In our minds, the South is still part of this country. So if you're escaping, we're going to have to return you. There was one general by the name of Butler who he kind of started this idea. He says, look, if slaves escape to me, I ain't returning them. I am going to call them, I'm going to basically confiscate them, and I'm going to use them for our cause. He's kind of the guy that planted this idea of you can attack the rebellion by getting rid of slavery, okay? He called them contrabands, okay? Now, when these slaves start running away, and of course a lot of Southerners are busy trying to track them down, a lot of the workforce, the people that made the uniforms and stuff, those people are going to be hurt, and Southern troops are going to have to come back and try to get back control of some of these people who had escaped, right? They're not going to be making stuff. Another key thing, and this is mentioned in your key concept, is this is really going to strengthen the moral cause of the Union, right? Because before, y'all, if you supported the United States, you were supporting a country that had slavery. And the British didn't really want to do that. And but now that the United States is essentially announcing we're going to be getting rid of slavery, this made it a lot harder for the British and the French, because they're like, oh man, if we support the South now, we're supporting a slave country over a country that has committed itself to ending slavery. So hopefully you guys understand the significance, what we call diplomatically, of that. And as a result, y'all, it was very unlikely that the Europeans, the British and the French basically, would recognize the South, because now only the South had slavery. Although, of course, we know, and this is maybe a little bit harder for them to understand exactly in Europe, but we know now that, that the North did have still a little bit of slavery. And so even though the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't end slavery immediately, y'all, it spells the ultimate doom. There is no way, y'all, that we're going to have slavery in the South once the Civil War is over. And probably we're going to have to end it in the border states. And indeed, y'all, the 13th Amendment will be passed and then finally completely approved by the states, and slavery will come to an end everywhere, including the border states. So hopefully after all of this, you guys have a much better understanding of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is something I'll talk about tomorrow. This is often forgotten about the Emancipation Proclamation. It included a part, y'all, where African American men could now join the Union Army and fight against the Confederates. Think about that, y'all. We had had all these thousands of African Americans who wanted to fight and would fight voluntarily, and instead we were drafting people who didn't want to fight. Who has more motivation in this war than anybody else, y'all? African Americans. Free their family members, free people who look like them, okay? And that's going to be a key reason for the victory here. And we'll look at their contributions, because AP loves to ask about that probably tomorrow. Now, a last thing here, though, and this, I guess, could be said as sort of a negative, but in a way it's a positive. There were people, y'all, like the so-called peace Democrats, who believed, let's just end the war, let's assure the South that we can expand slavery and that we're not going to end it, and we can bring back the South back into the Union. We can negotiate some sort of peace. General McClellan, ironically the victor at the Battle of Antietam, would be that guy who would run, promising y'all to end the war. But now that we basically told the South, look, dudes, you ain't going to have slavery anymore, this war would be fought to the very bitter end, okay? So any chance that this war would end without the South completely being defeated utterly, y'all, was gone. So that's a negative. But it did prevent us maybe having the South come back into the Union, y'all, with slavery. And then you talk about people fighting and dying in vain. You would have definitely had people who had fought and died in vain. Maybe the Confederates could say they hadn't died in vain, but you Northern guys, like, yeah, I don't know. Now, I have several political cartoons, and as you guys know with Mr. D, and this is where you guys will skip over the Horace Greeley thing, I have some political cartoons here for you. And I'm going to use these cartoons to to show you guys what you can get out of a cartoon, but also to talk a little bit about points of view. And I first saw this cartoon in a book about the Battle of Antietam. Now, this is actually not a Southern view. This is the Northern Democrats. Remember, Lincoln is a Republican. A lot of the Democrats don't want to end slavery. So this is their view of the Emancipation Proclamation. This is what appeared in their newspapers. So on your own, you guys, but I'll talk about it, and then on your own you can summarize what is happening, and always mention if you think you can identify an important person here. And then I think it's kind of neat knowing what's in it to come up with your own title, something better than what I have here that kind of tells us you understand the essence of this cartoon. All right, so let's look at this one. Lincoln plays his trump card. Now they're playing cards here, right? And you know, if you guys have ever played cards, when you know you've won, what do? You like slap that card down like, gotcha, dude. And that's kind of what's happening here. But let's start looking at this really carefully, okay? Now, here we see this man. Who does he kind of look like? Look at that beard. Look at that nose. He looks like Lincoln. But Lincoln isn't made to look just like Lincoln. Look at the hair. What do you notice about the shape of his hair? It's made to look like horns. And who has horns, we think? Satan. Right? The devil, Lucifer, whatever you want to call him. Right? So Lincoln is made to kind of look like Lucifer. That tells you a lot about how this guy feels about Lincoln and what Lincoln is doing. Notice, too, the sword. The sword is angled in such a way, y'all, to almost look like a tail. Once again, who do we know has a tail? Satan. Right? You see the tail there as well. All right? Now notice this. This thing is filled with detail. I mean, I love these things. They're playing cards, y'all. What's holding the card table up? Gunpowder. Is that a good idea? No. You don't play cards on top of gunpowder because gunpowder might explode on you. So what are they suggesting here? Lincoln is playing with gunpowder. This could explode right on him. Okay? So, I mean, I love these kind of things now. I know you can probably tell how much when I talk about it. Now, this is kind of offensive to some of you maybe, or to all of us, I don't know. This card he's playing is an ace. But when you look at the face of the ace, who is on that face? It's a black person. Literally, he is playing with the ace of spades. An ace of, very racist, right? You probably wouldn't see this on an AP test because of that, because somebody would have a traumatic fit and faint or something. But it kind of shows you this cartoonist is probably pretty racist when he has basically a black face being used here. But he's also, Lincoln is using the ace of spades. He's using literally black people as his trump card here. Pretty strong stuff. Okay? So that takes you guys through that cartoon. Remember the historical situation. Obviously, you want to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? Why Lincoln had done that. The audience is probably who? Fellow Democrats up north, right? People who are opposed to emancipation. People who, by our standards today, are probably kind of racist. And you just see this guy kind of looking and kind of smiling, as Lincoln plays this trump card and wins by using black people as a weapon. Very, very different view. Okay, so we're going to look at a Southern point of view of emancipation. Southerners, of course, we're talking particularly those states that had seceded, were very, very angry with the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're going to look at a picture there from a Southern newspaper. I'm not sure exactly which one, and I'm going to ask you guys on it to summarize what's happening, but I'll go through and talk about that a little bit, as well as to come up with your own title, and then you guys are going to do your hip-off. But I'll go ahead and talk you through some of it, all right? So here we see the picture. We see a man sitting at a table. He's writing, and you guys should look at that picture, and you should be able to figure out who that person is. You look at him, and it's Abraham Lincoln.
Could it be
now, yes, could it be Satan that is coaching Honest Abe? Because indeed that looks a lot like Abraham Lincoln doing it. Check out the little wings here of the little satanic critter that's holding the inkwell. You know, back in the day you had to dip your ink on your feather, your quill pen, to be able to do this. All right. Now also notice that Lincoln has his foot on what looks like a law book, or maybe it's the Constitution. Remember the Andrew Jackson picture? King Andrew, King Veto, right, where he is stepping on the Constitution. So Lincoln, according to the point of view of this picture, is stepping on the Constitution. Now, also behind Lincoln is a tray that looks like it has a bottle here. I suspect it's alcohol. You got a glass and another glass here. And if you notice anything, what do you notice about the bottle? Yeah, it's empty. What is that suggesting? Lincoln's been hitting the booze to do this. He has to get drunk. He is that desperate to be able to do this, okay? Now, I don't know if I have close-ups of these other pictures, but if you look over here, there's kind of a weird angel-like figure. I'm not sure what that means. This is the best version I can get of this picture, but check out some of the other imagery here. The table, right? If you look at the bottom of the table, the feet of the table are made to almost look like kind of hoofs of, like, who else but Satan, right? And of course we have vultures back here. Vultures are always kind of V-shaped in their wings, right? V. And for vulture, look at what's holding this what do you call it? The drapes here, the curtains. Once again, the skeleton of some other critter. The back of Lincoln's chair has what could be, I don't know, that's either a cow with really short horns or maybe some kind of goat or whatever. Not exactly sure what this is. I don't know if this is supposed to represent law, because oftentimes, y'all, the law is shown as kind of blind, but not exactly sure. It's got a shield here. It's got a sword. If you look, it looks like it may be cracked. Is that kind of suggesting that justice itself has been cracked because of what Lincoln's trying to do here? And then there's a picture in the background as well that shows people all fighting. I think I looked this up one time, and it was a picture of a slave rebellion maybe, and you just see all the chaos of that. I guess that's what they're suggesting, is if slaves are let free, there'll be all this chaos and everything like that. And Lincoln, despite that warning, is still doing that. So once again, he's drunk, he's desperate, he's exhausted if you had to describe him. And of course, you know, in a couple sentences, give me the historical situation here. What is happening that leads to this? Who do you think the audience is? Who are they trying to cause to hate Lincoln? Probably Southerners, right? And maybe even trying to reach out to some of those Northerners who want the South to come back, who really don't care if slavery continues on. And obviously, the purpose is to rally Southerners, get them to hate Lincoln, get them to think that his freeing of the slaves is an awful, desperate measure with the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? All righty. Now, when we look at this one, this is from a very different point of view. This is from the African American point of view, or from slaves' point of view. I'm not sure if a African American did this or not. It's done in Harper's Weekly. I don't know if you can see that up here. Harper's Weekly was a northern magazine, usually very Republican in its background, very anti-Democrat, and very, of course, or very anti-slavery, I should say. So this would be at least how they think, these probably white folks up in New York, where Harper's Ferry is published, how they think emancipation would be viewed there. So you're going to see, when you look over here on this side, you're going to see the horrors of slavery, what slavery was like, right? And I'm not exactly sure what this one is on the bottom. Looks like maybe a baby is being taken away. I don't think I enlarged that one. And then over here, you're going to see how they believe things will be for the new freedmen. Of course, in Reconstruction, it wouldn't quite be such a happy story for many of these freedmen and freed women, but at least this is the hope at the time. So let's go through and look at this in some more detail, right? Look at the picture overall, then think about a couple sentences to describe what's happening there. Remember, you got to do that on your AP test. And then come up with your own title, okay? The title, y'all, is a good way to show me and to show your reader a description of this, that you understand what this is doing. So let's go ahead and look at it in some detail, okay? We look over here, and like I said, we see the evils of slavery. We see his slaves running away. We see them hunted by the bounty hunters, of course, who were out there to try to get them and return them to slavery. If you look right here, and I just kind of noticed this is the Confederate flag at the time. We all think of the Confederate flag that has sort of the X across it. That is actually the battle flag of the Confederacy. That's what they flew in battle to make sure it looked different than the Union flag. This flag had some red stripes, a white stripe, and a blue background that had the number of stars for the states that had seceded. But in battle, that could easily get confused. But here you see also one of the worst things, of course, a slave auction. You see these people, standing by. You see the auctioneer, about to sell a human being here. You see what probably is the family of this slave, his wife, his kids, kind of begging, don't sell him, don't sell him, don't split up our family. And then we see others here, y'all, probably waiting. It looks like this guy may be kissing his wife goodbye. I mean, some pretty horrific images of what they perceive slavery to be, and probably pretty accurate, I hate to say. Now, when we look here, like I said, we get a close-up of the whippings, right, that sadly happen. And remember, this is a woman, and you notice her top has been taken off. I mean, she is literally being stripped there, and this guy is kind of having to hold her or watch. He looks like he might be African American. I mean, so he's having to participate and watch here. We see others being tied up, somebody here begging for help, others just passively smoking and watching this, and we watch this terrible whip. Awful, awful images, right? Now, we have this image in the middle. It looks like it kind of came and went there. But this shows you, of course, the happy black family after emancipation. They have their own house. They've got, nice chairs. It looks like here's grandma and maybe one of the sons with either his sister, or maybe it could be a wife. We got the father here who's happy to have maybe grandkids, or maybe that's his own kids. This kid doesn't look too happy. I think they're kind of jealous of this kid getting all the attention here. But, and then like I said, this one down here, it looks like it might be somebody begging for their child. Not exactly sure what's going on there. All right, now over here, we see some other images of what we think the end of slavery might bring. Here we see the American flag. And instead of the Confederate flag, which was featured over on the other side over here, right? We also see, like I said, here is that flag. I don't know if this will work if I mark it. Let me try here. Okay, yeah, here is the American flag, right? We also see what looks like a schoolhouse here. And of course, under slavery, students, African-American kids could not get an education. And look at this, and I know this is exactly the way it is every morning when you guys leave for school. Your mom stands out there. You energetically wave goodbye to mom as you happily make your way to Dobie High School. That's exactly, I'm sure, what your morning is as you make your way here. And we even see like the steeple of what I guess is a church here. African Americans being able to go to their own churches. All right. And then this one I think is really, really neat. And Mr. D kind of wondered at first what this is. I thought, well, is this voting? What is going on here? But I realized when I look at this, it says cashier, right? Yeah, hear that? Cashier, what do you mean? Are they buying stuff? No, they're getting paid for their work, which they never did, right? Unless, of course, they did side jobs, which some of them did. And they usually use that money, y'all, to get them a few things or to pay to try to get their own freedom or their family's freedom. But now they're being able to work for themselves. So you see the guy having to pay the African American freedman for his work. And you see other people waiting in line to get that as well, too. So interesting there. And back to the picture. So, of course, the historical context, the historical situation for this, give me a couple sentences. Obviously, talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, sort of the hope here that Northerners had, the intended audience. Maybe this is to try to convince people who maybe aren't so thrilled about the possibility of emancipation. It's definitely an idealistic view. You guys, knowing what comes in Reconstruction, if you've read your AMSCO, you know it's not going to be quite so happy. But no matter what, it still was better than slavery, of course. But it wasn't necessarily the idealistic view here, with African Americans freely being able to pick their jobs and work, their kids able to go off to good schools, all those kind of things wouldn't quite happen for some time. But at least this stuff, we hope, well, we know the slave auctions were over and chasing slaves down, and we hope the whippings and things were over. So this is very much a different point of view. Like I said, I don't know if this was done by an African-American person, artist, or whatever, but it definitely is pro-Republican, probably Lincoln, pro-emancipation, and you can see that and mention as proof of that the positive view that is given. The horrific view of slavery, and of course the positive view, incredibly positive, optimistic, utopian view of freedom, which, as I said, isn't quite yet to come. And it is, of course, very sympathetic with the slave. All right, so that kind of ends that part of the lesson for you guys. Next thing we're going to talk about, hopefully in class, is the African American contributions to the war. All right, thank you guys very much.